Truth Espresso episode 351.
In a world gone bonkers.
It is not, generally speaking, unruly, but fires have been started and...
Where the culture is a dumpster fire.
We're coming for your children.
And churches have lost their way.
I am really uncomfortable with the story of the crucifixion.
It's time to wake up with Truth Espresso.
Truth Espresso.
Your weekly shot of truth. And now your host, Daniel Minnick.
Well, hey there, friends, family, foes, and of course, lurkers alike. This is your host, Daniel Minnick, for another episode of Truth Espresso. And this episode is going to be a little bit of a break from the series that we have been doing, going through the Book of Mormon, and I will explain why in a little bit. You know, it's nice to take a break sometimes from the drudgery of long series of episodes, and so I figured I'd make this special episode if you're a social justice warrior or even an anti-social justice warrior, perhaps. This episode would interest you as I discuss why woke business really fails. So, over a week ago, I came to work and I noticed an issue of a magazine called Fast Company on my desk. And my first thought was that my boss subscribed each member of our software development team to this magazine so that we could all learn how businesses work, or how they should work to help the company. However, I noticed that none of my coworkers had their own copy. And of course, then my paranoia settled in. I was thinking to myself, uh-oh, is there something wrong with me? Am I negatively impacting our company? And my boss is trying to handle my foibles graciously by giving me some homework to read? A few minutes later, my boss came to my desk and he said something like, "I noticed you subscribed to a magazine there." And I said, "I know I didn't. I've never even heard of this magazine. I thought maybe the higher up did for us, but I'm not sure how my name at the company address got subscribed to a magazine. Maybe my company email address ended up in some third-party list that was sold behind my back, and I'll try to unsubscribe from it to make sure there are no charges for this unauthorized subscription." So I contacted the company and emailed back and forth until I made sure that the subscription, if there was any, was canceled and that my information was removed from their list. So now I had a free issue of a magazine and what to do with it. So instead of throwing it away, I figured I would thumb through the pages and see what it was all about. This is the summer 2025 issue of Fast Company. And the cover story is How Business for Good Went Bad. And the phrase business for good is in quotes. I had a sneaking suspicion of just what it was going to be about. I figured the phrase in quotes, business for good, was kind of a friendly term for stakeholder capitalism. Yup, as I began to read that article, I had to roll my eyes sometimes. If you don't know what stakeholder capitalism is, I'm sure I could make an episode or 10 on that topic. But just know that businesses advertising their diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, and their environmental, social, and governance, or ESG credentials comes from stakeholder capitalism, and that's a term that comes from the World Economic Forum. You know, Klaus Schwab and all that stuff. Davos, you know, those annual meetings where a bunch of dignitaries fly in their private jets up to Davos, Switzerland to talk about how they want to reduce the world's carbon footprint. Yeah, that World Economic Forum. And that's where stakeholder capitalism really comes from. So, do you remember corporations all changing their logos to rainbow colors in June for Pride Month? And do you remember Bud Light designing a marketing can for a young guy named Dylan Mulvaney, who claims to have transitioned from a man to a girl and who celebrates however number of days of girlhood he's currently on? Yeah, that all comes in some way from the ideas of stakeholder capitalism. And now one term that critics of stakeholder capitalism in its current form use is woke capitalism, or woke business. So how did we get big corporations in the 2010s and the early 2020s very quickly rushing headlong into a clown world of openly celebrating pride parades with floats of underdressed guys whipping each other in degenerate humiliation rituals? And how did we get companies like John Deere, Harley Davidson, Jack Daniels, and Bud Light that historically appeal to rugged American values and masculinity, thinking that supporting things like Drag Queen Story Hour is how they prove their virtue and that they're in fact not twisted, demented, and evil? Sure, Satan is behind all this nonsense. But what is the catalyst he used to foist clown world narcissism onto America and make it seem like the apex of virtue, and do that in a decade? So where does our story begin? Well, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, of course. Or, well, back in 2008 America, to be just a little more precise. And what seemed like the greatest investment economy in the world came crashing down in that year. The housing market was booming. The stock market was booming. And why do things that boom just all of a sudden go bust? And you will find lots of opinions about why and how that happens, and I just want to briefly pitch my own. I believe a lot of the explanations for this are simply wrong. And some of us knew the causes before the 2008 crash happened. And if the powers that be knew the real causes, they could have corrected the problem properly instead of finding an excuse for woke capitalism as the solution. So why did we even have a real estate boom and bust in the 2000s? In the year 2000, the federal funds target rate, and this is the rate at which the Federal Reserve lends money to member banks. They print it out of thin air, but they lend this money to member banks, and then those banks give loans to other banks or customers at slightly higher rates to make some profits, of course. But in the year 2000, the federal funds target rate was as high as 6.2%. And just 2 years later, in 2002, the Fed had slashed rates down to 1.75%. Now, why did they do that? Well, there were several catalysts here. The stock market collapse of the dot-com stocks, the internet stocks, in the 1990s, and the terrorist attacks on 9/11 or September 11th, 2001. Those were two of the catalysts. And yes, each of these two events had their own set of catalysts, but I have to begin somewhere in our story before I commit some kind of mathematical atrocity. So let's just look at 9/11 for now. When a bunch of bad guys hurt people and destroy things, most people get scared and they want the ones personally affected to be able to put their lives back together. That's the major focus. But the professional economists have their own fears. They're not thinking necessarily of the well-being of individuals affected by tragedies. They're worried about aggregate demand. Now, especially those economists who follow the legacy of John Maynard Keynes, which is about 99% of them. When bad things happen, the economists worry about what's going to happen to aggregate spending. If people are too afraid to get out and buy things, that might make businesses go bankrupt and implode the economy. So instead of keeping a level head and realizing that bad events might temporarily affect the economy, the economists think they need to push the big red shiny buttons and pull the big red shiny levers to keep the economy going. Because without their genius, it's all too fragile and will shatter like glass windows in a hurricane. So they think consumer demand is what drives an economy rather than the supply that makes demand possible. They put the cart before the horse, you see. No one demanded an Apple iPhone before Apple marketed the iPhone. And I can demand a personal spaceship to Mars in 2025 all I want, but the supply isn't there. So terrorist attacks in New York City? Yeah, unfortunately, that will make people afraid of flying for a while. That will make people afraid of shopping in large stores and malls for a while. So what's the solution? Well, the economists think that we have to spur people from the top down into parting with their hard-earned money anyway against their better judgment. Maybe we should just let the market work it out. Some retailers might be willing to take risks and slash prices to get people to take the risk of bargain shopping in their stores. Weigh the risks and the rewards. Lower prices and the risk of the small chance that a bomb might drop. Yeah, maybe I'll take that risk and get some lower prices. Eventually, as more people get used to the incentive of lower prices or bargains from coupons, they will shop more, and the increased demand will get enough razor-thin profits to keep companies in business. And as companies stay in business and make some money, the increased demand would also allow them to adjust prices back up to normal, and the country's economy would recover naturally without intervention. However, we know politicians and professional economists simply don't trust you or the market to figure out how to handle bad situations. They just have to manage things from the top down, and that always leads to bad things in the future. Now, on September 27, 2001, at the Chicago O'Hare Airport, President George W. Bush said, quote, "When they struck, the terrorists, they wanted to create an atmosphere of fear, and one of the great goals of this nation's war is to restore public confidence in the airline industry. It's to tell the traveling public, get on board, do your business around the country, fly and enjoy America's great destination spots, get down to Disney World in Florida, take your families and enjoy life the way we want it to be enjoyed," unquote. Now, I don't know if President Bush really intended this to call America to patriotic consumerism, but there were people who thought the government needed to stimulate consumer activity rather than let people retract for a bit and then eventually let businesses try to lure them into spending money with incentives for customers. No, the government thinks they need to make us spend money, stimulate us to spend money. And people bought new plasma TVs on loans for $10,000 to $30,000 a pop at the time to show how patriotic they were. Yeah, terrorists, you can't scare me. I'm heading to Best Buy to max out my credit card. You'll be crying uncle in no time. Take that, terrorists. But it wasn't just patriotic shopping that created a market bubble in the 2000s. As I mentioned before, interest rates going from 6.2% way down to 1.75% has to do something, right? And what do you think happens when interest rates get low? If you guessed more borrowing, you should try out for the game show, Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? Now, with federal interest rates floored at less than 2% there, what do you think this encourages a lot more people to buy? Now, picture yourself as a contestant in Who Wants to Be a Millionaire to answer this question. What do you think 2% interest rates might encourage a lot more people to buy? Is it A, a pack of bubble gum, B, a TV dinner, C, a Lego set, or D, a house? Think hard. I know $1 million are on the line. Need to phone a friend? Need to poll the audience? Is that your final answer? The correct answer is D, a house. If you guessed D, congratulations, you just won $1 million, or 1 million pats on the back from yours truly, virtually, I guess. Yeah, we'll go with that. Because, yeah, a genius like you realizes it's not rocket science. Lower interest rates encourage people to borrow more money to buy more expensive things than they wouldn't be able to afford otherwise. So why not buy a house or go to college or start a business, especially one that might carry a little more risk because it's cheaper to do so? It's a lot cheaper to finance a house when lower interest rates make your monthly payments a whole lot lower. Now that we realize lower interest rates make a lot more people buy houses, what do you think happens to the price of houses? Remember the laws of supply and demand. A lot more demand for houses starts happening. If demand goes up faster than supply, prices go up. So low interest rates make people buy houses. And people buying houses en masse makes the price of houses go up. So what do you think will happen eventually? I mean, the price of houses can't just keep going up forever. At some point, when only millionaires can afford to pay off a house, we've kind of gone off the deep end. The market for new houses begins to shrink as fewer and fewer new buyers can afford these overpriced houses. Houses take time to get from planning to building to living, you know. So we end up with suppliers having a glut of new houses in their inventory, but not enough people can afford to buy them at sky-high prices. So the suppliers are forced to sell these houses at lower prices to get buyers. They may even lose money on the deal, but it's better than getting no money while houses sit in stock and collect financial dust. So with a housing boom spurred from low interest rates comes an inevitable bust. Naturally, interest rates couldn't stay at 1.75% forever either. The money starts to inflate, and inflation will go through the roof. So during the 2000s, after the rate slash, the Fed tried to raise rates gradually during the years. And by 2006, the Fed rate had adjusted up to 5.25%. Now, obviously, that makes mortgages less affordable too, but it's necessary to keep inflation lower. Now, I was one of the few no-name Americans who understood that the real estate market was in a bubble that would soon burst, and I was in my 20s. Now, not to say I was some kind of prophet or even a genius at all. I was just learning about the Austrian School of Economics in 2006 and was watching an economist and stockbroker named Peter Schiff of Euro-Pacific Capital argue with pundits on financial news shows on TV that the housing market would collapse. And I watched people laugh their heads off while he argued with them. And I bought the original edition of his book, Crash Proof: How to Profit from the Coming Economic Collapse, when it came out. Needless to say, I wasn't in the market for a house at that time. Now, if you're a millennial or an older Gen Z or just anyone who studies recent history, you know what happened. There was a huge real estate and stock market crash in 2008. Yeah, of course, I didn't mention the whole mortgage-backed securities thing in the stock market to keep the investments in real estate going, but I won't waste time with that. But that was another thing that was planting the seeds for a huge real estate crash. Just know that along with housing prices collapsing was a stock market collapse felt the most in real estate investment funds. So what was the government's solution to this crash? To recognize that they made a mistake and caused the market bubble? No, of course not. It was to blame business for being too greedy. You mean businesses just decide to get extra uber greedy together and in certain sectors of the economy and for no discernible reason? Maybe we need to think a little deeper than that. Somehow the quote-unquote free market is just unstable and prone to problems, and the good old saints in the government are doing their dead-level best to give it a slap on the wrist and smooth things out. Yeah, but we know better how things work and what really happened and who the enablers were. Lower interest rates make people do things that are unsustainable. But no one wants to blame the Federal Reserve, they just want to blame Wall Street. Now, of course, Wall Street did contribute to the problem, but they wouldn't have had anything to contribute to a problem like that if they weren't enabled by things like low interest rates.
Are you just watching? When you gather the family around the TV, are you prepared to use your biblical worldview to discuss what you see with your spouse and kids? It takes a little practice to not just watch. Are You Just Watching? The Entertained Christian's Handbook to Consuming Media with Purpose is a guided journal with worldview-shaping info and lots of guided note pages to help you watch and discuss anything you put before your family's eyes. Purchase it now on Amazon.com. And don't just watch.
So President Bush and Congress decided the best thing to do was to bail out the banks and the Wall Street corporations. On September 29, 2008, President Bush announced the Economic Stabilization Act.
Working closely with my administration, congressional leaders from both parties produced the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act. A bold bill that will help keep the crisis in our financial system from spreading throughout our economy.
And in a CNN interview on December 16, 2008, President Bush said this.
I've abandoned free market principles to save the free market system.
Well, at least he was being honest. What he didn't understand was that the whole system of a Federal Reserve messing with interest rates messes up the free market system and creates bubbles in sectors of the economy that inevitably bust. And then we get a new round of government intervention and rate slashing, and that starts a new bubble. And the result is that normal life gets harder and harder for Americans, price inflation keeps climbing, and people and institutions connected with the government get more and more wealth transferred to them. Remember during the pandemic when the Fed slashed interest rates down to 0 to 0.25%, and the very quick housing bubble that exploded in just a few short years? And then, remember all that inflation? I think we have a lesson we can learn from the 2000s and from the pandemic, but do you think government's going to learn its lesson? Do you think that we're going to see some of the same type of policies when the next bubble bursts and we end up with another recession followed by slashed interest rates and we get another bubble? Probably not. They're probably not going to learn their lesson. So back to 2008. So the Wall Street bailouts began. Naturally, the solution didn't go down well with most Americans. Plenty of people didn't like this. Now, they all didn't agree on the causes and stuff like that, but everyone had a reason to be frustrated. And big corporations and banks could gamble, it seems, with people's money, and their punishment is to get bailed out with free money from taxpayers? It's kind of hard to find a hero in this story. So after about 3 years of this apparent corporatocracy robbing Americans blind, a movement took to the streets on September 17th, 2011, and birthed the months-long Occupy Wall Street protests.
Wall Street! High Street! Wall Street! High Street! Wall Street! High Street! Occupy Wall Street!
So, Occupy Wall Street started as a movement to protest the greed of Wall Street and their stranglehold on the system. But what was the solution? I mean, we couldn't just tear down businesses that sell products we use. We couldn't just let the government formally take over businesses because that would lead to an outright corporatocracy and monopoly. So I guess we need businesses, but the businesses have to realize they need us, not just our money. So the thought went. So back to the article from Fast Company magazine, it says on page 51, quote, "After decades of serving shareholders alone, CEOs were now embracing the idea that they should also be concerned about stakeholders, employees, customers, suppliers, local communities, and even the planet. The notion of business for good had become mainstream," unquote. So you've heard of the customer's always right? Well, the decade of the 2010s saw big corporations almost flip that notion on its head to become moral nannies over their customers. And the article from Fast Company on page 52 also says, quote, "Big corporations changed their policies to embrace diversity and sustainability and begin taking vocal public positions on political issues, something they had typically shied away from for fear of alienating customers," unquote. Yeah, that's a problem. When customers shop for shoes, they're there to look for quality shoes at a decent price. They want the company to focus on making quality shoes at a decent price. There's nothing evil from either side about that, as long as it's a result of ethical competition with no lying, cheating, stealing, or violence to make it all happen. Who cares? But this new shift after the Great Recession of 2008 to the World Economic Forum's stakeholder capitalism was kind of a form of self-imposed penance for big corporations. It was like they were saying, "We recognize we're the big Wall Street bad guys. We recognize you don't like us. We recognize we have all this power in our hands. And we recognize we can't get rid of that power. So why don't we use that power for good? It's the least we could do as penance for being big evil corporations." You might have even noticed that all the political virtue signaling came from big corporations, because the little mom and pop grocery stores and shops in town didn't really care about that nonsense. They couldn't afford to pay for that stuff. They need to make money. And stakeholder capitalism, or woke capitalism, is a luxury for the large companies, just like the Wall Street bailouts were for the large companies. Fossil fuel behemoths like ExxonMobil and Chevron realized that their permission slip from the public to continue to exist as oil companies would be to promote public causes while they do their evil, greedy, planet-destroying business. As long as they weigh the bad with the good, they can stick around. They can continue to drill and refine oil if they also make environmentalist groups happy by investing in green energy. Okay, fine. If you have some good ideas about how to transition from fossil fuels to an alternate energy source, I'm here for it. If you could do so in a way that's friendly to the free market and doesn't impose anything on public life, more power to you. Just don't donate to globalist Marxist organizations that want to depopulate the planet and force legal schemes on us that reduce energy availability and that can lead to higher energy prices and massive suffering and death, please. But stakeholder capitalism and the big corporate penance wasn't just about environmental stuff. It included things like voicing support and donating to LGBTQIA2S+ groups. When the Great Recession in 2008 happened, the cry for Occupy Wall Street was that big corporations held too much power and influence over politics. Well, what do we call it when big corporations are now publicly taking sides in political issues, giving to political causes, and supporting certain political candidates? I would think that it's still corporations holding too much power and influence over politics, wouldn't you think? It's just that the shape of it has shifted. And to tell you the truth, shoe companies, cereal companies, pharmaceutical companies, financial institutions, and all of the other ones preaching the same message and shaping culture is far scarier to me than whatever corporatocracy we saw in the early 2000s. I mean, it sounds more Orwellian under woke capitalism than just businesses being greedy with securities and interest rates. So, as the Fast Company article describes, business for good really meant business for leftist Democrat Party social causes. As far as I can tell, this stakeholder capitalism has shown itself to be fully on one side of the political spectrum. The Fast Company article on page 52 mentions that, quote, companies pressured North Carolina over the anti-transgender bathroom bill and Georgia over a voter ID bill, unquote. So why does business for good mean business engaged in political campaigns in state laws? And why does it only mean what the social Marxists want? Why not simple, good, old-fashioned family values of the father, a mother, and kids? If you want business for good, I would think that would be better. So the Fast Company article goes on to mention that, quote, when Disney's then CEO Bob Chapek stayed silent about Florida's parental rights and education bill, better known as the Don't Say Gay bill, he was lambasted by employees until he apologized and the company announced it was formally opposing the bill, unquote. So that's stakeholder capitalism for you. That's woke capitalism at its best. And it was the employees, it wasn't really the people that the company's really trying to serve. It's the middle management employees of Disney that are setting the cultural norms here. And you might remember the battle between Disney and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Disney wanted to retaliate by making at least half the characters in newer Disney movies LGBTQ+, and have more of that stuff in the Disney World theme park. Well, DeSantis retaliated by removing their special tax exemption status, and the battle between the two continued as DeSantis believed that woke was a dangerous ideology that harms children, families, and schools.
We fight the woke in the legislature. We fight the woke in the schools. We fight the woke in the corporations. We will never, ever surrender to the woke mob. Florida is where woke goes to die.
Now, the Fast Company article on page 54 mentions that the tide against woke companies began to turn after 2022. It observes that, quote, the signal example of this was the boycott of Bud Light over a social media marketing collaboration with trans influencer Dylan Mulvaney in 2023. Bud Light's second quarter sales fell by 10% year over year, and it lost its place as the best-selling beer in the U.S. market, unquote.
This month I celebrated my day 365 of womanhood, and Bud Light sent me possibly the best gift ever, a can with my face on it.
I mean, the sheer hubris of it all. At some point, normal people start to wake up from this woke madness and realize Hey, why am I working so hard to feed my family? And companies like this think marketing with a spoiled guy who claims to be a girl and stereotypes girlhood is a good thing? It seems like moral causes corporations are pursuing have jumped the shark into pure narcissism. You can stop lecturing us about morality when your moral causes are about celebrating clown world activity. True morality values families, not whatever this is. So the boycott of Bud Light was the most successful conservative boycott in known corporate history. And the liberal media was not happy about it, but hey, when conservatives protest something, they just simply protest with their wallet. They chose not to buy Bud Light beers. They didn't take to the streets and destroy things. Anheuser-Busch tried to solve the problem by just making ads showing horses and heartland culture. They didn't really understand the problem. People weren't boycotting Bud Light because they wanted them to advertise to them also. They didn't want to give money to a company that supports causes and lifestyles they believe are destructive. You know, as the Apostle Paul says in Galatians 5:9, a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. If we found out some company was funding terrorist organizations abroad, the solution isn't just to run ads flying the American flag. It's to stop supporting the terrorism. It's not compatible with supporting America. Now, Bud Light didn't understand that the problem wasn't a both-and thing. It was an either-or thing. You simply cannot support people or movements that are all in favor of undermining family values and supporting gender changes for children. If they had openly apologized, explaining how they were wrong to do that, and pledged that they wouldn't do it again, the boycott would have ended a lot sooner. Merely trying to speak out of both sides of their mouth was just adding insult to injury for their typical customers. But of course, you know, they were probably scared because the loud voices from the woke mob demanded that they didn't apologize, so Bud Light tried to straddle the fence there, and that wasn't working out for them. Now, people had been putting up with and brushing off the environmental stuff for a while, but when companies seemed to force people into critical race politics with supporting Black Lives Matter, while people were rioting and looting and burning things in the streets, and their obvious anti-family Marxist ideology in 2020 and beyond, and then sponsoring pride parades where men with fetishes expose themselves in front of children, you know, the tide just started turning a bit. The virtue of stakeholder capitalism and woke politics was divisive and destructive to what most people held dear. It didn't help when inflation really started to pick up near the end of 2021 and raged in 2022, because families were struggling paying for groceries. But the corporations were letting them know that childless social media influencers who wanted the world to celebrate their personal fetishes were the ones who needed attention and support. Enough was finally becoming enough. Like, is there something wrong with us when we see a bunch of people whining about being oppressed when they don't have to take care of other people like children and spouses, and their most important thing that they want us to know about them is how they find personal pleasure? Yeah, there's a problem. And girls especially have paid the price for all this cultural woke nonsense. Because some guy claims he's really a girl inside, he can waltz into their bathrooms at school. And if girls show any discomfort or objection to this, then they're the bigots. And all the hard work that they do to win at female sports, they have to cheer on guys pretending to be girls as they use their muscular superiority and larger lungs to take trophies and even college scholarships from them. Where's the virtue and good in that? I think people started to realize that so-called business for good jumped the shark. And to think, as I've explained through all this history, the catalyst for all this woke, degenerate nonsense is that people didn't really understand economics and why the 2008 collapse happened. And the wrong solution was to do the big bailout instead of recognizing that meddling with interest rates and fiddling with the market is what caused the big boom and bust in the housing market and the stock market. So if we understand economics, we could realize that it has ties to virtue and that we don't have to go down this road of businesses trying to be woke and quote unquote good as the solution for being so evil with capitalism in the 2000s. Yeah, just thought I'd point out that, maybe economics has something to say about virtue. The normal patriotic and family voices in America felt like they were a David up against the Goliath of all branches of government combined with every corporation under the sun. So the few and the patriotic stood up to the absolute behemoth where you have the government and every major corporation pointing the finger at them and telling them what we're supposed to value and what morality is. As Vivek Ramaswamy wrote on page 24 in his book Woke Inc. Inside Corporate America's Social Justice Scam, quote, when CEOs tell people what they're supposed to think about moral questions, then people stop believing that their own opinions really matter, unquote. Yeah, you think? As to the ideology corporate America was following from the World Economic Forum, Ramaswamy also says this on page 21 of his book, quote, stakeholder capitalism poisons democracy, partisan politics poisons capitalism, and in the end we are left with neither capitalism nor democracy, unquote. Now, of course, the most important source that we should consult against woke business and stakeholder capitalism ideology is the Word of God. And Isaiah 5, verses 20 through 21 say, woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe unto them that are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. You mean the Bible is where we should get our morality, not the ideologies of globalist elite organizations? Contrary to the perversions of nature and truth about how we were designed as humans and men and women, Jesus said this in Matthew 19, verses 4 through 6. Have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. So that's really what social good is all about. Not a bunch of clown world people trying to rub their own personal fetishes in your face, but how God designed us male and female and how he designed marriage and family. And contrary to all the discord that critical race theory promotes, the Apostle Paul said this in Acts 17:26 through 27. And God hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. So we're all created in the image of God. We're all made of one blood. We're all made to have nations and such. And we're all made together to seek after the Lord. The Apostle Paul warned us about how the devil works with the ideologies of the world and how we should prepare. Ephesians 6 verses 11 through 12 say, "Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." So we are told to wear truth, righteousness, faith, salvation, and the gospel against a world plunged into darkness and fake virtue, and the ideologies of the principalities of this world. So I hope that this episode was thoughtful, and maybe you didn't realize just how we got suckered into this woke stuff in the 2010s and 2020s, and how that all came about from history, what the catalysts were. Now, I'm not planning to record and release an episode of Truth Espresso for next week, because I have some weekend plans that are not going to make an episode feasible. So don't plan on a new episode of Truth Espresso next week, but I would encourage you to stay tuned for the next episode of Truth Espresso, and God bless.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Truth Espresso. Be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast app. Truth Espresso is a member of the Christian podcast community. Check out other great faith-building shows at christianpodcastcommunity.org.